The explosion rocked my backyard like a war zone. Bits of aluminum, scorched wood, and melted plastic rained down like confetti, landing in the neighbor's pool 2 houses over. My ears were still ringing when I stepped out of the kitchen and saw what was left of my shed, basically nothing but a smoking crater and the twisted remains of my vintage barbecue grill. And standing at the edge of my fence, arms crossed like she just ended world hunger instead of committing felony arson, was Florence Sanderson, the Queen Karen of the Evergreen Hills HOA. "I warned you, Isaac," she shouted, her voice shrill enough to pierce through my still buzzing eardrums. "That racket you call music was violating decibel ordinances. HOA Code 9.8, I blinked at her. "You blew up my shed." "I enforce the rules," she said, like she was proud of herself. "And don't think I won't do it again if you bring back that noise pollution." Now, I know what you're thinking: how the hell does a middle-aged HOA president just destroy someone's property and think she's in the right? Well, welcome to Evergreen Hills, where Florence and her cronies ran the HOA like a private dictatorship. They fined people for the color of their doormats. They inspected lawns with rulers, and if you parked a truck on your own driveway, God help you. But this crossed every line imaginable. I looked down at the smoldering pile that used to be my shed and took a deep breath. I could have screamed. I could have called the cops right then and there. But instead, I turned and walked back inside, because she had no idea who she'd just messed with. See, my name is Isaac Thorne. I'm a mechanic by trade, a stubborn pain in the ass by personality, and I've got a younger brother, Ian, who just so happens to work for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. And guess what case he'd been quietly working for the last 6 months? You guessed it. Evergreen Hills HOA. They weren't just petty, they were dirty: embezzlement, kickbacks, fake fines, and forged citations. Ian's team had been gathering evidence, building a case brick by brick, and Florence? She just gave me the last one, arson. I picked up the landline and called Ian. "She blew it up," I said flatly. There was a pause on the other end. "Blew up what?" "My shed." "She used some kind of jerry-rigged propane bomb, I think." "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. I've got footage too. Security cam caught the whole thing." He let out a low whistle. "All right, that's it. We're going in." I hung up and stared out the back window. Florence was now yelling at my neighbor Henry for having his trash bins 1 inch from the curb instead of flush against the driveway. She thought she owned this place. But she was about to find out what it felt like to be on the other end of the rules. 3 days before the explosion, it had started with a speaker. I'd been working late hours at the shop all week and finally got a Saturday to myself. So I plugged in my Bluetooth speakers out back, cracked open a beer, and fired up some classic rock while I reorganized the shed. It wasn't even loud. But Florence lived 2 houses down and somehow claimed she could feel the bass shaking her spine. She marched straight into my yard without knocking, her little clipboard clutched like a weapon. "You're violating HOA sound restrictions." Section 5.2. "Florence, it's 2 in the afternoon. "Doesn't matter. I've already issued a warning. If this continues, we'll be taking further action." I laughed. "What action?" "You gonna ban Led Zeppelin?" "I'll do what needs to be done." That should have been my first clue she was unhinged. The next day, I got a fine taped to my front door. $500, handwritten, no official letterhead. And in the reason box, someone had scribbled, "Noise pollution and hostile behavior." I took it straight to my brother. "This is the 3rd fake fine you've gotten," Ian had said, flipping through the others I'd saved. "They're not in the HOA bylaws, and there's no paper trail showing where the money goes. You pay these." "Hell no," I tossed the others. "Good, keep collecting them. We're compiling evidence." There's something big going on here. Turns out, Florence had been funneling money into a maintenance fund that didn't actually maintain anything. Instead, it funded upgrades to her own house: new kitchen counters, a home theater system, and even a koi pond in her backyard. All paid for by fake fines and special assessments. And I had just become her newest target. The week before she blew up my shed, I caught one of her little HOA minions, a guy named Brent, taking photos of my house from behind a bush at night. I confronted him and he claimed he was checking for code violations. Code violation, I said. You're trespassing. He ran off before I could get anything else out of him, but it was clear Florence had it out for me. Then, 2 days before the explosion, someone slashed the tires on my pickup. No witnesses, no fingerprints, but I had a hunch. That Friday night, I installed a full security camera setup, front yard, backyard, side alleys, everything. I didn't say a word to anyone, and thank God I did. Because Sunday morning at 6 a.m., Florence snuck into my backyard wearing all black, dragging a small propane tank and what looked like an old metal toolbox. She propped it next to the shed, fiddled around for a bit, then ran off like a kid playing ding-dong ditch. 30 seconds later, boom. My camera caught every frame. After I called Ian, things moved fast. By Monday afternoon, 2 unmarked black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood. Ian stepped out with his badge along with 2 other agents. They weren't here to play. I gave them the footage. They watched it 3 times, then nodded. She's done, Ian said. The agents paid Florence a visit that same day. I watched from my porch as she answered the door in her usual pastel cardigan and pearls, her expression flipping from confidence to panic the moment she saw the badges. "You can't come in without a warrant," she shouted. "We've got one," Ian replied calmly, holding up a folder. They went in. 30 minutes later, they came out with boxes of documents, a laptop, and her HOA binder, which was basically her personal Bible of tyranny. Florence followed behind them, handcuffed, screaming about deep state conspiracies and retaliation against motherhood. The entire block came out to watch. It was the most beautiful HOA meeting I'd ever seen. By the time Florence was booked at the county jail, the neighborhood felt like it had just been unshackled. People who used to avoid eye contact with each other at the mailbox were now gathering in driveways, swapping stories about fines that didn't make sense and visits from HOA inspectors, who never logged anything officially. It was like someone had thrown open the blinds and let sunlight pour into a room that had been sealed off for years. But we weren't done. While Florence was sitting in a holding cell, still convinced she'd be out by dinner, Ian and his team were turning her tidy little empire upside down. The documents they pulled from her house were more than damning. They were a blueprint for a racket that had been running for over 4 years. The so-called maintenance fund she'd been siphoning from was only the beginning. Turns out, she'd been collecting bogus compliance fees and routing them through a dummy landscaping company, Greenleaf Services, which was owned on paper by some distant cousin in Wisconsin. But in practice, had no employees, no equipment, and no actual jobs completed. Every inspection that warranted a fine, fabricated. The photos they used as evidence were pulled from a stock photography website, and those special assessments for community playground upgrades. The only thing that had been upgraded was Florence's wine cellar. Ian's team traced over $70,000 missing from HOA accounts. And the kicker, she wasn't working alone. Wednesday morning, a second round of arrests swept through Evergreen Hills. Brent, the guy I'd caught taking photos behind my lilac bush, was hauled out of his house in his bathrobe. Gloria Phelps, the neighborhood treasurer who always wore oversized sunglasses and never made eye contact, was cuffed while walking her toy poodle. Even Mark Delaney, the HOA vice president who once threatened to tow a veteran's pickup for having a DARE sticker, was led away in silence. But the biggest shock came when they searched the HOA's storage unit on the edge of town. "What exactly do you store in a climate-controlled unit for an HOA?" I asked Ian as we stood outside it, watching agents with gloves and flashlights move in. "Receipts," he said. "Invoices, permit copies. Or at least, that's what should be in there." What they found instead were 12 sealed banker's boxes, each labeled with a year. Inside, hard copies of fine notices that never made it to homeowners, all of them unmailed, all of them marked paid in red ink. which meant Florence and her inner circle had been inventing charges, logging them as paid, and pocketing the money without ever notifying the homeowners. The HOA's books showed a clean record. But in reality, dozens of people had unknowingly paid for things they were never billed for. That afternoon, I got a call from Mr. Renner, the retired mailman who lived across the street. He was one of the few people Florence never messed with, probably because he kept to himself and still flew the American flag every morning without fail. "You mind if I come by?" he asked. "I think I've got something you'll want to see." He showed up 20 minutes later with a folder thicker than a phone book. "I started keeping these after my daughter said something felt off about her dues statements," he said, handing it over. "Every notice, every receipt, every envelope dated and scanned. I've got a scanner in my garage." I flipped through the folder and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Some of the fines he'd received were for things like improper hedge symmetry and non-compliant mailbox paint. One even cited fence post angle discrepancy. "These were all paid?" I asked. "Every last one. Check numbers are on the copies." We gave the file to Ian. That folder filled in the final puzzle piece. Florence and her group hadn't just manufactured fees, they'd selectively mailed them, targeting people they thought wouldn't ask questions. Elderly homeowners, families with language barriers, people too busy to fight back. Thursday morning, the local paper ran a front-page piece. Evergreen Hills HOA under federal investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and property damage. The article featured a still from my security cam footage, Florence crouched beside my shed, mid-sabotage. The headline might as well have been a victory banner, but not everyone was celebrating. A few residents, especially the ones who'd benefited from Florence's favoritism, were still clinging to the idea that this was all some kind of mistake. "She couldn't have done all that," said Carla Jensen, who lived on the corner lot with the pristine artificial grass and 3 flagpoles. "Florence organized the annual pet parade. She donated to the county library. She also detonated a propane bomb less than 20 feet from my house," I said. "You want to keep defending her, be my guest. Just don't expect the neighborhood to forget who looked the other way." Later that day, I was approached by a man I'd never met before, tall, probably in his late 50s, with a clipboard and a badge clipped to his belt. "Isaac Thorne?" he asked. I nodded. "Name's Wheeler. I'm with the State Department of Housing and Community Development. We're conducting a full audit of Evergreen Hills HOA. Your brother provided your contact. Mind if I ask a few questions?" We sat on my front porch for the better part of an hour. Wheeler wasn't just interested in Florence's crimes, he was digging deeper. Looking into how the HOA had been allowed to operate so autonomously for so long. Turns out, Evergreen Hills had never filed annual financial disclosures with the state. Their elections hadn't been properly documented in over 5 years. And worse, they'd amended their bylaws without the required majority vote twice. "This HOA," Wheeler said, flipping through his notes, "isn't just corrupt, it's legally invalid. Its charter was never properly registered after the 2017 revision. That means every fine, every enforcement action, every lien, they're all unenforceable." "You're saying the HOA doesn't legally exist?" I asked. "Not in any way that holds up in court." That night, the neighborhood gathered in the cul-de-sac. No one called the meeting, it just happened. Word had spread and people needed to talk. Henry, my next-door neighbor, stepped up. "So what happens now?" he asked. "No HOA." "Do we just do whatever we want?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I say we vote," said Mr. Renner. "We can form a new association, one that actually represents us, not some tyrant with a clipboard." Voices rose in agreement. "Let's get a real board, real elections, a cap on dues." "Transparency. Can we even do that?" someone asked. "We can," I said. "The old HOA's dead, legally and literally. It's up to us now." That weekend, we held the first real election Evergreen Hills had seen in over a decade. We used the community center. Everyone brought potluck dishes and folding chairs. Ballots were printed, collected, and counted in plain view. No closed-door tallies, no whispered campaigns. I didn't run for anything. I didn't need to. Watching Florence hauled off in cuffs was enough, but I did nominate Mr. Renner for president. He accepted, reluctantly, but with a quiet nod that said he understood the responsibility. By Monday, the new board had reached out to the county clerk to begin the process of registering the HOA properly. They pledged to refund every homeowner who'd been fined under fraudulent pretenses. And they agreed to dismantle the old surveillance policies, replacing them with a simple rule. If it's not hurting anyone, it's not a problem. As for Florence, she was facing multiple felony charges: fraud, racketeering, misuse of community funds, and criminal damage to property. The arson charge alone was enough to keep her locked up as a flight risk. Her trial was scheduled for later in the year, and the DA made it clear they'd be pushing for the maximum sentence. I never rebuilt the shed. Didn't need to. Instead, I turned the space into a small garden. Just soil, herbs, and a few tomato plants. Simple. Honest. Something Florence would have hated. I watered it every morning, right around the time she'd used to patrol the neighborhood with her clipboard. And every time a new leaf sprouted or a bloom opened, I thought about what it meant to take your space back, not just your yard, your voice, your rights, your peace. Evergreen Hills had been hers for too long. Now it belonged to all of us. The first official board meeting under the newly elected HOA took place the following Thursday in the community center, the same one Florence used to reserve exclusively for her afternoon bridge club and private wine tastings. This time, folding chairs were arranged in an open circle instead of tight rows facing a podium. No stage, no microphone, just neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder. Mr. Renner, now President Renner, stood with a legal pad in his hand and a pair of bifocals perched at the tip of his nose. He didn't speak like a politician, he didn't have the polished cadence or buzzwords. He just told the truth plainly. "We did a full internal review of the association's accounts," he said. "There's a shortfall of just over $94,000. We've confirmed that none of it went to actual neighborhood maintenance or infrastructure. Not a cent." The room was quiet, no outrage, just the weight of knowing you'd all been robbed blind for years. "Legal counsel from the county is helping us prepare civil claims to recover what we can," Renner continued. "And the state's already filed criminal charges. But we're also going to need to decide how we move forward. We have no reserve, no operating fund. And the last legitimate financial report filed under our name was in 2016. A woman near the back raised her hand, a younger mom I hadn't met before. "So does that mean we're responsible for the mess they left behind?" Renner nodded slowly. "In part, but we're not alone. The state's offering matching grants to communities that restructure after fraud investigations. We'll qualify." That night, committees formed organically. A retired accountant volunteered to help with audits. 2 high school teachers offered to put together a neighborhood welcome packet and community calendar. People who hadn't spoken in years began brainstorming landscaping projects and neighborhood watch routes. There was no more fear of retaliation. The clipboard dictatorship had fallen. But as the community picked itself up, the legal storm around Florence deepened. Ian called me the next morning. "She's trying to make a deal," he said. "Wants to exchange testimony for a lighter sentence, but there's a problem?" "Let me guess," I said. "She's not the top of the ladder." She wasn't acting alone, not just in the HOA. There's someone outside the neighborhood, someone who helped her set up the fake companies. That propane tank setup. She didn't come up with that alone either. She had help. "And we think we know from where. You saying there's a bigger operation?" "Yeah, and it's uglier than we expected." Florence's bank records showed regular transfers, small ones but consistent, to an LLC based in Nevada. The name meant nothing. Horizon Management Solutions. But when Ian's team dug into it, they found 7 other HOA boards across the state funneling money to the exact same business. All of them had similar complaints: sudden fines, inflated assessments, secretive meetings, and aggressive enforcement. Evergreen Hills wasn't an outlier. It was a pilot project. Worse, Horizon Management had been quietly buying up empty lots in suburban neighborhoods and using shell companies to get seats on HOA boards. Once they had majority control, the new boards rewrote bylaws, installed punitive rules, and started extracting cash from residents through fake fines and service fees. Florence had been paid to run Evergreen Hills like a revenue farm. And when she got too bold blowing up my shed, for example, she exposed the entire operation. Within 2 weeks, federal agents raided Horizon's Nevada office. The place was practically abandoned, just a receptionist and a filing cabinet full of shredded documents. But they found enough to link it to a man named Victor Langston, a former real estate tycoon whose license had been revoked in 2 states for predatory housing practices. Langston hadn't just created Horizon. He designed it to be invisible. The LLCs were layered through offshore accounts. The management contracts were buried in HOA meeting notes that were never distributed to residents. And the profits, laundered through real estate trusts and fake construction companies. Ian's team called it one of the most elaborate housing scams they'd ever seen. When news broke that Florence was cooperating with the investigation, not to save herself but to cut Langston out of a plea deal, everything shifted. Because Florence wasn't just testifying, she was naming names. She admitted that Horizon had provided her with templates for fines, scripts for board meetings, and even pre-filled bank deposit forms. They trained her on how to identify residents who wouldn't fight back older couples, immigrants, single parents working 2 jobs. She called them low-risk targets. She also admitted that the propane device wasn't her design. It had been assembled by someone Horizon put her in touch with a man named Curtis Dale, a former security contractor with a history of arson charges that never stuck. Curtis was arrested in Arizona 3 days later trying to board a private charter flight with a fake passport and a duffel bag full of burner phones. By then, the Department of Justice had taken over. It wasn't just about HOA fraud anymore. It was racketeering, organized crime. A multi-state scheme designed to exploit legal loopholes in suburban governance for profit. And Evergreen Hills had been the match that lit the fuse. Despite everything, Florence tried to paint herself as a victim. In her statement to the court, she claimed she'd been manipulated, that she thought the fines were legitimate, that she never realized the funds were being misused. But the footage of her planting an explosive device on private property kind of undercut her credibility. At her sentencing hearing, the judge didn't mince words. You weaponized your position in a neighborhood trust structure to enrich yourself and intimidate others, he said. You conspired with known criminals to defraud your community, and you committed acts of sabotage that endangered lives. You are not a victim. You are the architect of this disaster. She was sentenced to 14 years without parole. Langston's trial was scheduled for the following spring. He faced over 30 federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and attempted witness tampering. His lawyers tried to delay proceedings, claiming health issues, but the court wasn't buying it. As the legal machine rolled forward, life in Evergreen Hills began to normalize. With the HOA no longer functioning as a personal fiefdom, people started reclaiming their homes. Lawns grew a little wilder. Wind chimes returned. Kids chalked up the sidewalks again. There was a sense of breath returning to lungs that had been held tight for too long. I spent most evenings in the garden where the shed used to be. The tomatoes were coming in strong and the basil had overtaken an entire corner. Sometimes, neighbors would stop by, not to complain or criticize, but just to chat. Real conversations. No pretense. One evening, Mr. Renner dropped by with a folder under his arm. We're filing a class action, he said, handing it over. Against Horizon, against Langston. Anyone who paid a fraudulent fee or assessment is eligible to join. I figured you'd want to be the first signature. I didn't hesitate. I added my name, then passed it back. "Where's it headed?" "Federal court," he said. "They'll try to delay it, maybe settle, but we're not backing down." "You think we'll win?" He looked out over the garden, then back at me. "We've already won. Now we just make it official." The following month, Evergreen Hills held its first neighborhood block party in years. No permits, no fear, just folding tables, trays of homemade food, and music that played well past dusk. I brought out the old Bluetooth speaker, the one Florence had complained about, and let it run through every Zeppelin track I had. Not a single person asked me to turn it down. As the sun dipped, I noticed something new. A mural on the side of the community center wall. Painted by a local art teacher and a few students, it showed a neighborhood under siege, gray and rigid, slowly blooming into color. Trees, people, laughter. And in the corner, a broken clipboard lying in the grass, no words, just the image, perfect. We'd been tested, lied to, controlled. But we didn't fold, we rebuilt together. The Horizon management fallout didn't ripple, it detonated. By early fall, 3 more neighborhoods in the state had filed formal complaints citing eerily similar patterns. Fines for things no one could validate, aggressive threats of lien placement, and sudden leadership changes where no one recalled voting. Ian told me the DOJ was coordinating with state attorneys general across 4 states. What had started in my backyard with a propane bomb and a Bluetooth speaker had pulled the tarp off a multi-million-dollar racket. But while the federal gears churned in the background, Evergreen Hills moved forward with a kind of cautious optimism. People still glanced at the community bulletin board expecting another list of citations to appear. It didn't. Instead, they found flyers for bake sales, a neighborhood tool exchange, and a sign-up sheet for a community garden expansion. I kept to my usual routine, working long hours at the shop, checking in with Ian when I could, and watching the garden thrive where the shed used to be. But I wasn't ready to let go of what Florence had tried to do, not just to me but to everyone. One Wednesday morning, just after sunrise, I got a knock at the door. It was a man in a polo shirt and slacks, carrying a leather briefcase and an air of urgency. He introduced himself as Mitchell Greer, Assistant District Attorney for the county. "I'm heading up the local side of the Langston prosecution," he said. "Your brother passed along your name." I invited him in and poured 2 coffees while he reviewed a thin manila folder. He didn't waste time. "Langston's defense team is trying to suppress Florence's testimony. They're claiming coercion by federal agents. We need corroborating witnesses. People who interacted with her before the arrest. People who can show a pattern of corruption independent of the Horizon connection." "You want me to testify," I said. "I want you to tell the truth under oath. That she used her HOA position to harass, intimidate, and defraud residents. The explosion is already in evidence. But the daily pattern, that's what gives it context." I agreed before he finished the sentence. He nodded once and slid a court summons across the table. "Preliminary hearings next week. You won't be alone. We've got 6 others lined up." But your story's the one that woke this case up. The courthouse was packed that day, not with press, but with people. Residents from other neighborhoods, curious city council members, even a few retired attorneys who smelled blood in the legal water. Langston wasn't present, but his lawyers were. 3 of them, all sharp suits and sharper tongues. When the judge called me up, I didn't feel nervous. I felt ready. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft tapping of a stenographer's keys, as I described the events leading up to the explosion, the fake fines, the retaliatory vandalism, the surveillance. I showed them the security footage again, this time on a government-issued tablet. The judge watched every frame without blinking. Langston's lead attorney tried to rattle me. "Mr. Thorne, isn't it true you had a personal grudge against Miss Sanderson? That you deliberately provoked her with loud music?" I played music on my own property during the day. "She entered illegally and committed arson. That's not provoked, that's criminal." The courtroom didn't make a sound, but I saw the judge's jaw tick slightly. The attorney moved on. After my testimony, I stepped off the stand and caught Renner's eye. He gave a subtle nod, then followed me out during recess. "They're going to push for plea deals," he said. "Langston's team will try to bury this under settlements and sealed agreements." "Not if the residents file civil suits," I said. "We keep it public. We make it impossible to ignore." He smiled, not smug, not triumphant. Just the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd lived long enough to know winning wasn't always about headlines. 3 weeks later, Florence withdrew her cooperation. Rumor was Langston offered her hush money through an offshore account. But the DOJ had already frozen her assets. With her credibility shot, the prosecution leaned harder on local testimony, mine, Renner's, and the statements from residents across the county. Langston's team shifted strategy again. They tried to disqualify the class action suit, arguing the HOA boards were independent and Horizon Management was merely a consultant. That failed when investigators found internal memos buried in an encrypted folder on Florence's confiscated laptop memos outlining quarterly revenue targets and instructions for high-yield enforcement zones. That same week, a surprise witness came forward. A former Horizon employee, Sarah Del Vecchio, who'd helped onboard new HOA partners. She provided emails, payment records, and internal training documents that described homeowners as untapped revenue streams and compliance-dependent demographics. The judge reviewed the new evidence and ruled that the case against Langston would proceed to a full federal trial. No plea deals, no sealed settlements. Everything would be on the record. Back in Evergreen Hills, the changes kept coming. A permanent community liaison was selected, an attorney who lived 2 streets over and volunteered to ensure the board followed all state and municipal guidelines. The bylaws were rewritten from scratch in a public workshop series. Every clause was debated, voted on, and recorded. We even got rid of the fines altogether. Instead, violations, actual ones like fire hazards or blocked sidewalks, were handled through mediation. No threats, no surprise fees. Just neighbors talking like adults. One evening, I was loading groceries into the back of my truck when a man I didn't recognize approached. He was in his 30s, wore a faded ball cap, and had the kind of cautious body language that said he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "You Isaac?" he asked. "Yeah, you live around here. Just moved in. Bought the house on Maple Ridge, heard about everything that happened, figured I should say thanks." I nodded. "You're welcome. Whole neighborhood made it happen." "Well," he said, glancing around, "I've lived in 5 different places in 10 years. This is the first one where people seem to actually care about each other." He walked off before I could say more, but the words stuck with me. Later that month, the federal trial began. I wasn't called to testify again, but I followed every day of it. Langston's lawyers tried to paint Horizon as a misunderstood business model and innovative property management solution that had been misused by overzealous local actors. But the jury didn't buy it. The verdict came down hard, guilty on 26 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and criminal enterprise activity. Langston was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison with no chance of parole for at least 25. The court also ordered restitution over $12 million to be distributed among affected communities. Evergreen Hills was awarded nearly $500,000 in direct restitution funds, enough to repair aging sidewalks, upgrade lighting, and fund community programs for the next decade. At the next board meeting, Renner stood up and announced he wouldn't be running for re-election. "I never wanted this job," he said, "and I never planned to keep it. I only stepped up because someone had to. But now that we're stable, it's time to pass the baton." He nominated a woman named Ava Patel, a software engineer with a calm demeanor and zero interest in drama. She accepted with a short speech about transparency, accountability, and never letting power go unchecked again. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind to help stack chairs. Renner came over, slow and deliberate, and offered a handshake. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we earned this. And we'd faced down a sprawling criminal operation that embedded itself into the fabric of our homes. We dragged it into the light, piece by piece, until there was nowhere for it to hide. And we'd built something better in its place, not perfect, not utopian, but honest. That night, I sat in the garden as the last light faded from the sky. The air was warm, the crickets loud, and in the distance, someone was playing a guitar on their porch. No one told them to turn it down. I leaned back, let the quiet settle around me, and thought about Florence Langston and everything they'd tried to take, and how none of it had worked. Not in the end.